Think about it logically. So what are we doing with the sanctions? So Biden and other leaders are telling Americans, hey, Russia's got gasoline that you need and food that you need, but you can't buy it from them anymore. We're not going to allow you to buy these goods from Russia. So you got to buy the goods someplace else. Well, now we have to pay more because now there's all this demand from, the other sellers. They have much higher prices now because we've eliminated all the supply that was coming from Russia. So Americans end up paying a lot more for those goods that the U.S. government won't let us buy from Russia. But now think about it from Russia's perspective. Russia still has all their oil. They still have all their food that's now way more valuable because we've caused the price to go up. And now they're able to sell either illegally on black markets or to other nations that are still trading with Russia. They're actually still able to sell their oil and their food. They just get a higher price for it than they were before. So Russia may be winning from the sanctions, and it's Americans, it's Europeans who are losing. So I think that, like most things the government does, it typically backfires. Like when the government creates an anti-poverty program, you end up with more poverty, not less. And so by sanctioning Russia, we're probably going to end up helping Russia and hurting ourselves, especially by highlighting to the world the dangers of using the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency. And so we may have just hastened the demise of the dollar as the reserve currency, which means we accelerate the collapse of our own economy. Let's say because of the sanctions, a product that Russia was selling went from $1 to $3. And so now the market is $3 and it's really expensive. And now under the table, illegally, Russia says, hey, we'll sell you this stuff for $2, right? You can get it for a big discount to the $3. There are going to be people who will illegally buy that stuff because they're saving so much money paying $2. But at $2, Russia still gets double what they were getting before the sanctions. So Russia wins, and everybody else loses as a result of those sanctions. So, that's how I think this ultimately plays out. Last time I looked, the ruble was higher than it was when the war began and the sanctions were announced. Now, initially, there was about a 40% decline in the ruble, and President Biden was bragging about how much value the ruble lost. Well, the ruble has recovered all of that lost value and then some. Now, the ruble is still a lot lower than it was a year ago, so it's not like we have a strong ruble, but it has strengthened recently. And I believe that that is a trend that's going to continue. And right now, the dollar has been very strong against a lot of other currencies, in particular the euro. Wasn't just a ruble. But I think that dollar strength is eventually going to reverse as well. I think the dollar is going to come under a lot of pressure when the markets realize that the Fed is bluffing about its ability to fight inflation, and that when the markets, figure that out, and the Fed is ultimately forced to reverse because of the weakness in the economy and the markets, I think the dollar is going to tank across the board, including against the ruble. And now that Putin has kind of fixed how much gold the Central Bank of Russia is willing to buy priced in rubles, if we see a very weak dollar in terms of rubles, that will put a lot of upward pressure on the price of gold because a lot of Russian banks will be buying gold that they can turn around and sell to the Russian government at a profit. And the strength in gold will also accelerate the decline of the dollar and feed the whole process. Well, I look at gold as money, as a store of value, not as an investment per se, like you invest in stocks or real estate. You hold on to gold to preserve value because it doesn't throw off a return like stocks or real estate do. People don't really understand the degree to which the American economy is dependent on the dollar and its role as the reserve currency. You've often heard the U.S. economy described as a service sector economy, right? We're all about services. Well, where do we get all the stuff then? Because we certainly consume a lot of stuff. Americans are, incredible shoppers. I mean, we have an insatiable appetite to buy stuff, right? But if we have a service sector economy, where's all this stuff coming from that we're buying? Well, it's coming from China and other countries. Well, how do we pay for it? We don't. We just print money. You see, under a normal economy, if we didn't have the reserve currency, we would either have to produce stuff for ourselves or produce stuff for our trading partners to trade with them for the stuff they produce. But we don't have to produce anything. We just print money. And the rest of the world takes the money we print for the stuff they make. And so we have a much higher standard of living because we get to consume all this stuff that we didn't have to produce. So we didn't really pay for it. But when the dollar loses its status, then the rest of the world isn't going to want dollars anymore. They're going to want stuff. And so if we want their stuff, we're going to have to make some stuff of our own to give them. And we can't do it because we don't have the factories. We don't have the savings to create the factories. We don't have the supply chains. We don't have the skilled labor. We don't have anything that a manufacturing economy needs because we're no longer a manufacturing economy. I mean, we manufacture a little, but not nearly enough to satisfy our demand. So what would have to happen if the dollar was no longer the reserve currency is American spending would implode. Consumption would collapse because we'd have nothing to buy. And so our entire GDP would implode. We'd have a massive recession because Americans wouldn't be buying anything because we couldn't afford anything. And all the shelves would be empty because foreigners wouldn't be sending us the stuff that they produce. And we don't have the capacity to produce it for ourselves. The only way to avoid that would be for the U.S. government to act fiscally responsible. But that's never going to happen. In fact, as long as the dollar is the reserve currency, we have no incentive to be fiscally responsible. So that's the problem here. We're going to keep on doing this until there's a crash, because the only thing that will stop it is a crash. Because we won't voluntarily, face the music, because, it's so politically damaging to the people in power to do that. So, and I also think that a lot of people in the U.S., including at the Fed, just take for granted the dollar's reserve currency status. I mean, they don't think that we could ever jeopardize it, that no matter how much money we print, no matter how much our deficits are, the rest of the world is just going to go along for the ride. And I think they believe that because they've gone along so far. And, we've gotten away with it this long. And so the belief is we'll get away with it indefinitely. And I think that hubris is going to have a big price because that's not going to be the case. And I also think that the Fed and the U.S. government have underestimated the degree to which that reserve currency status is so, integral to the entire bubble economy that we have, our whole service sector economy. That's the linchpin. You pull that out and everything implodes. It was taxes and regulations that made the U.S. uncompetitive relative to the rest of the world. And then it was going off the gold standard and going on a dollar standard where once the dollar was the reserve currency, the rest of the world needed dollars. And how did they get dollars? Well, they sold stuff to Americans. And so we basically outsourced our entire economy. And in the short run, we benefited because the cost of production was lower overseas than it was in the U.S., especially because American companies had to deal with high regulations, high taxes, labor unions, all sorts of other things that ran up the cost of production that foreigners didn't have. And of course, a lot of the regulation, the labor laws, the environmental laws, these other countries didn't have to deal with that. And so they didn't have to bake the cost of complying with those regulations into their labor cost, into their price of their goods. And the wages were already, much, much lower in the other countries. So Americans got a good deal. We traded our jobs for stuff. And we did that for decades. But, we can't do it anymore because we now have so much debt, and wages around the world have increased to the point where there's not a big arbitrage left anymore between labor costs outside the U.S. and labor costs inside the United States. And foreigners don't want to, play this game anymore. They have too many dollars. They have too many U.S. treasuries, and we're making that apparent by, flexing our muscles with these sanctions. I think that we've reached the end of the road here on this game. And, when we experience the true consequences of what's happened, because, we've been living on credit cards and borrowed money and imported goods, and we don't realize how drastically things are going to change for the worse when we can't rely on those things anymore. Those lifelines are going to be gone.